Welcome, everyone. My name is Arago. I'm the program manager at I-FPRI. Just a little bit of background before introducing our presenters of the webinar today. So today's webinar is jointly organized by the Methods module of the Gender Platform, CGIAR Gender Platform, and I-FPRI's Gender Task Force as part of the We Validate COP webinar series. So for those of you who are not familiar with the COP, so this We Validate COP stands for Women's Empowerment Measurement Validation Community of Practice. And it's a virtual community that we established last year under the Methods module to convene researchers who develop and validate women's empowerment measures. So we are hosting one webinar per month throughout 2022 on various women's empowerment measure related topics. And we had one webinar, the first webinar last month in February, and this is the second webinar of the series. If you're not the member of the COP and you're interested in joining, please feel free to reach out to me after this webinar. And now I want to go ahead and introduce our presenters. So we have Erdgin Mane, who's a policy officer in the Inclusive Rural Institutions and Gender Equality Division at FAO, where he leads the analytical work and the impact evaluations of food security, nutrition, and agriculture programs on gendered outcomes. We also have Rumbidzai Ndoro, who's a doctoral fellow at UNU Merit Maastricht University, Graduate School of Governance in the Netherlands. And the final presenter will be Annarita Macchioni Giaquinto. She's a gender equality and women's empowerment specialist at FAO, focusing on analytical work and gender analysis. So they will be presenting the study exploring the empowerment of Nepalese women in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic by using the abbreviated Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, or A-WEAI survey tool. So the presentation will be organized into 3 parts, each followed by brief comments from a discussant. So we have 3 discussants today. We have Sudhindra Sharma, the Executive Director of Interdisciplinary Analysts, or IDA, based in Nepal, and he'll provide comments on the first part of the presentation. The second discussant is Hazel Malapit, Senior Research Coordinator and co-lead of the Methods module at I-FPRI. And the last final discussant is Jessica Light. She's a research fellow at I-FPRI. So briefly, just in terms of the logistic, after we finish all the presentations and the comments from the discussants, there will be a Q&A session briefly for about 10 to 15 minutes at the end, which will be moderated by Emily Myers, research analyst and gender task force coordinator at I-FPRI. And as you can see, since we have a quite tight schedule today, I've asked the presenters to answer questions in the chat as much as they can during the webinar. And we can try to address the remaining questions or the questions that needed further clarification or discussion during the Q&A. That's it from me. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Erdgin to get us started. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much, Ara, and thank you to I-FPRI colleagues for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here, and many thanks to all of you for being here. So let me share immediately my screen.
Great, we see it.
So as Ara said, today we'll be talking about women's empowerment in agriculture in times of COVID-19. We have some panel data evidence from Nepal, and today I'm here with I would call them 2 newborn WEAI experts. No, this is their first. They are both 2 economists, Annarita and Rumbi, and this is their first time to analyze the WEAI indicators. So it's a pleasure for me to share this work with them. In what will be the outline, Ara mentioned there will be 3 parts. I will talk in the first part about, I'll spend a bit of time to describe a bit the data, the genesis of this study, the objectives, and what were the challenges that we encountered in collecting data through CATI. Through computer telephone interviews. computer-assisted telephone interviews. Then the second part will be about the A-WEAI results, where we look at the change from 2017 to 2020, and we will be doing some heterogeneous analysis, and we'll look basically at the gender intersectionalities of the A-WEAI. And finally, the third part will be some sort of, we try to assess the impact of COVID-19, and in particular self-reported shocks on the A-WEAI indicators. And finally, we would like to discuss a bit some of the future research with this data. So as I said, I would like to spend a bit of time describing the data and this challenge, because I think it's important to see what can be done with this data, and eventually discuss also the ways of what could be some additional research work that can be done with this data in the future. So what was the genesis? This study, the first survey was conducted in 2017. And this was at that time a collaboration between FAO, World Bank, IFPRI, PIM, and IFAD. In practice, this work was started by Vanya Slavczewska, who is here, Susan Karia, myself, Cheryl Doss was involved at that time, and colleagues from World Bank. IFAD came somehow later. They were interested to look at the climate change aspect. So, and then basically wanted to look at the climate change. So we included in this survey GPS coordinates in order to link this data with rainfall and temperature measures, and do some analysis to assess how the climate change affects the decision to migrate. And we have already published a paper on that with colleagues from IFAD. So the scope of this study was to evaluate the implications of male out-migration for inclusive transformation and feminization of agriculture, food security, and women's economic empowerment, and as I said, climate change. So in 2017, the data were collected by the Nepal school and IDA, and include the sample of 1,000 households from 5 districts. So there was a random sample in these 5 districts, but we used 2 strata, migrant and non-migrant households. So basically, because the scope was the migration, so the strata included this, and of course the data are weighted based on that sampling strategy. So these districts were purposefully selected based on 2 criteria. So they had a high out-migration rate based on the latest census data. And finally, we want to have a wide coverage of the country. So we cover both agroecological zones, the Terrain hills, and also the developmental regions of so-called developmental regions of Nepal. So, and then we had already an agreement with the Nepal school and IDA to do a second round of this analysis in 2020, basically maintaining the original objective of looking at male migration and women's empowerment. But we also joined forces with our social protection team at that time. So we wanted to look at also how social protection intervention like cash transfer, in particular child grant, affects the decision to migrate by the household member, changes in intra-household decision-making due to migration, and the remittances received by the household from a migrant member. So, and then of course we wanted also to look at what is the impact of migration on rural poverty, both in terms of consumption and human capital, and how does social protection moderate this impact. But finally, after we had signed this agreement with the Nepal school and IDA, then COVID came in, and so we decided to somehow expand the scope of this survey. We had, given the risks, so we have to move from CAPI to telephone interviews, basically, and we also wanted to capture some aspects of COVID. So, in particular, what are the effects of COVID-19 and the lockdown on the food security of rural households, on women's work and empowerment, and finally, what is the role of social protection in mediating the impact of COVID-19? So this is the survey design for the study. So as I mentioned, the sample was equally distributed across the districts, and are representative of each district, of the rural areas of each district. And then because the social protection beneficiaries were very few in the first round, so we increased the sample size with the so-called booster sample with 800 new beneficiaries, new households, which are 50% participants of CGP child grant programs and 50% non-participants of CGP program. And this, of course, by maintaining also the strata for migrant and non-migrant households. So in the new round, we basically had I would say, a relatively low attrition, 8%. So we basically had the same household, 921 households were the same household that were interviewed in 2017. And it is, I think this is a great success considering that 3 years have passed since from between the two waves. And of course, moving from in-person interviews to telephone interviews required us and in particular let's say Nepal school and IDA to a lot of efforts, to get also the telephone numbers and make sure that they are correct and get as much as possible coverage rate of the sample. So of course, these 80 households that were missing were replaced by new ones, and of course in each word we maintain the stratification between migrant and non-migrant households. So these are the 5 districts. The blue ones are the 5 districts that we had originally sampled. And then we wanted to look at this social protection aspect, and which basically was concentrated in the hills, in the Dalit communities. I would like to mention briefly the structure of the questionnaire. The questionnaire was quite broad at the first wave because and was highly focused on migration aspects. So of course we have the roster of the questionnaire, the employment model, which was quite rich, and then we had a lot of information around migration, the migration history, and the migration dynamics. So looking at past migration, current migration, and also remittances. Of course, as FAO, we are highly interested in land and crop production and productivity aspects, livestock, agricultural inputs to measure agriculture in order to measure the net incomes, transfers and other incomes, and this includes social protection transfers, housing conditions and services. We also had food consumption, non-food consumption, but because it's not a good strategy to have long questionnaires with telephone interviews, we basically removed those 2 sections, and we included a new section around COVID-19. In terms of the A-WEAI, we did our best to maintain the A-WEAI model the same as the baseline. So we maintained all the models that we had originally, but we had to make a change for the time use. We could not afford to collect time use data through telephone interviews. But what we tried to do is we included a couple of questions on time allocation. In particular, we had a question that tries somehow to mimic the indicator that we generally get from the on workload. So basically, we asked in the last 24 hours, how many hours did you work at home or outside, including home, including household chores and other domestic activities. And then, of course, we asked, has your amount of working hours changed because of COVID-19? So this is an indicator related to COVID that Annarita will be talking more later. So this survey was conducted in October, and you can see this was the peak of the cases in the country, and this required a lot of efforts from the IDA and Nepal school to make sure that let's say that the survey was properly conducted and avoid the risk of getting affected. So what are some of the challenges with CATI and some of the solutions that were undertaken? Conducting telephone interviews requires a lot of logistic problems. For the enumerators, they need to work from their home. Generally, they need to work from their homes with minimal equipment, setup, unstable connectivity, lack of electricity, and then supervisors need also to plan and coordinate. It's not easy now if the enumerators are in their homes. And again, technical personnel need to ensure smooth running of the whole infrastructure. So what was the solution that the IDA adopted? So the interviews, basically, the enumerators conducted interviews from the Nepal school premises, so to ensure a coordination and a smooth data collection process. The long questionnaire lead to respondents fatigue, which we know, and may hinder data quality. So some of the strategies that we adopted, so the questionnaires were, of course, reduced and streamlined. The household and the A-WEAI modules often, in many cases, had different respondents. So, and a small compensation was provided to the interviewers in order to complete the interview. We also suggested to have multiple sessions when people feel tired, to have the so-called the call attempts roster to call back the households, and of course the piloting and the quality assurance procedures that were put in place. Another aspect that is tricky with telephone interviews is the use of speakerphones by the respondents. So as you know, the presence of other members may affect the responses of the respondent for sensitive questions. So one of the solutions we adopted, we instructed enumerators to ask and record about the presence of speakerphones during the interview, so to make sure and maybe to control this during the analysis. And of course, another problem was to finding the correct phone numbers. This required a lot of effort from the partner. So basically, they did additional listing at country level. Now, what is the country context? Many of you already know Nepal, because IFPRI conduct a lot of work in the country. As you know, Nepal is frequently referred as a gender development success story. And a lot of indicators have improved through time, but there is also still the gender disparities remain high. In 2019, gender equality index ranked Nepal at the 110th position out of 189 countries. There is a stronger gender division of labor and requires women to undertake almost all the time consuming and domestic duties. There is at least 2.5 hours from some latest estimate of difference in terms of workload between women and men. And then, of course, the minorities and women from ethnic minorities and groups considered low caste, like Dalit, as well as women living in lowlands, plains of terrain. These are disadvantages and are greatly compounded. So this is going back to the data. So just to describe a bit the type of data that we have at hand. As I mentioned, we have we have the panel component and we have this booster sample. So because these were beneficiary of social protection programs, as you can see, the two groups are very different in various domains. As you can see, for example, the booster sample is generally larger in household size, and the sample is confined to the hill region. The same applies also for the individual characteristics. The booster sample are less educated from hill, Dalit, and greater share of women. This is to say that this is why for this analysis, we want to look at the panel component. So we have been focusing our analysis in the panel part of the survey, because we found this is more relevant in order to generalize our results for this paper. So so again, I wanted briefly to show the indicator of well-being that we have been using in this survey is the prevalence of moderate and severe food insecurity based on FIES. So the results, as you can see, this is the heterogeneous analysis across the various groups that we have in our sample. As you can see, the panel component is basically the prevalence of food insecurity was 8.8%. And this is actually very similar to what we found in 2017, which was actually 8.9%. So there is only 1 decimal point of difference. Of course, as you can see, the prevalence of food security in the booster sample is twice as much. And as you can see, the prevalence of food security in the hills is twice as much as in Terai. And you have that the areas of Rolpa and Acham are much more food insecure than others. Of course, you can see also the difference for the 3 income groups that we use throughout the descriptive statistics. they range from 4% in high income to 12.3% in the low income group. And actually, what is surprising is that the food insecurity is higher for households with international migrants. So I give the floor now to Annarita for the second part of this paper.
Thanks, Erdgin. Actually, before we move on to the second part, I think I'm going to invite, yes, our first discussant, Suhindra, to share some feedback, reflections, or even questions on the presentation. Since we don't have much time, it would be great if you could just make it very brief, about 3 minutes. Over to you, Suhindra.
Thank you, Ara. When Erdgin had mentioned about the presentations and the session to me, he had asked if I could focus a little bit on CATI challenges in undertaking WEAI. So I'll probably elaborate on that a little bit. Let me mention the context of the study. At that time, things were evolving, and we had not initially planned to do a phone interview through CATI. So as the situation evolved, the choice that was left to us was either drop the study altogether or try the best as we can to actually do phone interviews. So we thought that one of the challenges in Nepal in doing phone interviews is that the phone numbers of respondents changes rapidly. So, generally these phone numbers are valid for 5 months, 6 months, and people take up new SIM cards and change the numbers. So before we began the study, we thought that, okay, we will do a kind of a tracing where we try to contact the respondents that we had contacted in 2017 and check with them their availability, and also through their neighbors, because some of the sampling was such that the neighborhood had been sampled. So it was a kind of a snowball kind of a technique in verifying whether or not the numbers that the respondents had was same or not. So this really helped us in ensuring that we get the more updated contacts of all these respondents. So that helped a lot. So I'd say that, doing that kind of a tracing before the actual survey really helps in ensuring that the non-response rate is very low. Second, as I mentioned, it was a very quickly evolving situation. So at that time, before and then this point basically relates to the new booster sample of 800 individuals spread across 2 districts, Rolpa and Acham. Now, the question was, how do we get access to this sample? So we decided that, okay, we will do a face-to-face household listing. So at that time, the regulations were such that the government would allow limited travels within that particular district. So we had enumerator supervisors who belong to those districts, and we contacted them and asked them whether they could do a thorough household listing in these areas that we were planning to get extra, booster sample from. And so they were able to basically do that. And the criteria in doing that has been mentioned by Erdgin very well. And then we basically did the study. Another point that I want to mention and kind of elaborate a little bit further about what Erdgin said was that given that internet accessibility, etc., for our enumerators could be a problematic issue in Nepal, we said, okay, why don't you come to ID office? ID has 3 fairly good sized halls, so, and then also a spacious compound. So what that meant was that the enumerators could spread around the compound, the halls, because again, they would also have to comply with the COVID rules of social distancing and all that. But we managed that within the office. So they were able to get the telephones done by working from the office itself. Another issue that Erdgin touched upon was the fact that this was a kind of a longish survey. There were many back and forths between FAO team and Nepal School IDA team about, which modules to reduce or minimize or do away with. And so we try to kind of shorten the questionnaire to the extent that was possible. And then we commenced with the interviews. What I think also helped was the fact that we told the respondent that we will top off their prepaid phone after the interview. So we had a provision of about $2 for each respondent. So I suppose that helped, but still, once the interview continued for 45 minutes, we did sense that the respondents were getting a little restless, and there was some persuasion that needed to be done by our enumerators. Yeah, and the final point, I think, that was the compensation related issue. Yeah, I think Erdgin has already touched upon the fact that the time allocation module was slightly changed. I guess, yeah, that's it. If there's any more thoughts that comes in my mind, I think I'll keep it in the chat box. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sifindra. Thank you so much. Now we're going to move on to the second part of the presentation. Rumbi, are you ready? I'll turn it over to you. Yeah, thanks.
I'm ready. Thank you, Ara. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute. At this juncture, I would like to discuss our results for the heterogeneous analysis for the 6 key A-WEAI indicators using 2017 and 2020 Wave 1 and Wave 2 panel data. Next slide, please. Right, so I think one slide back, thank you. To begin, we calculated the uncensored headcount ratio, that is the proportion of respondents who are inadequate in a given indicator for individuals who responded to the standard administrated A-WEAI questionnaire module for Wave 1 and Wave 2 data collection periods. The table we provided shows deprivation indicators comparing men and women in Wave 1 and Wave 2, where all results that are presented are structured to show inadequacy or to be interpreted as disempowerment. As we observed in Wave 2 in 2020, there were a greater proportion of women compared to men inadequate in 3 indicators: access to and decisions on credit, ownership of assets, and input in productive decisions. There was a higher percentage of men compared to women inadequate in group membership. When we compare changes between Wave 1 and Wave 2 of data collection periods, we observed that over time, there's a statistically significant increase in constraints for women in particular in indicators of input in productive decisions, group membership, and ownership of assets. Our results suggest a sizable decrease in constraints between Wave 1 and Wave 2 within the indicator of access to and decisions on credit for men and women. The shift is not due to any measurement change, as the questionnaire administered and the methodology adopted was the same for each wave. However, for the changes observed within the workload indicator, calculations on the uncensored headcount ratio are not comparable across waves due to changes in data protocol. So this is something that already has been touched upon, but to speak about it more in detail. In Wave 1, the productive and domestic workload indicator is derived from a detailed 24-hour time allocation module, whereby respondents are asked to recall the time spent on primary activities in the 24 hours prior to the interview. However, as Erdgin mentioned, in Wave 2, the workload figures are drawn from a direct question, and this was done due to time. We asked how many hours the respondent worked in a productive and domestic capacity within the last 24 hours. So due to this discrepancy in data measurement procedure, we are cautious when we're comparing the results across waves, which may suggest that the hours worked both men and women over time. Could you go to the next slide, please? I believe it's in the appendix, but there will be a table that represents the same information in graphical representation for better readability. In this particular slide, we present the overall aggregated A-WEAI results for both Wave 1 and Wave 2. These are also presented and interpreted in terms of disempowerment. The The table shows that each wave's calculations with and without the workload indicator, given the problematic nature of the indicator's data collection protocol. So this points to, speaks to Hazel's point as to how we were able to address this indicator. So in this case, we were able to calculate both with and without the indicator. And as we do so, we're able to adjust the weights for each of the indicators so that we're able to assess what are the key, whether there are very large differences, whether we add or subtract this workload indicator. This particular case, I'd like us to focus on the calculations without the workload indicator. So in this case, columns 3, 4, and consequently column 6, which suggests for the overall full sample, the disempowerment headcount or the censored headcount has increased by about 9 percentage points. This is also true for the disempowerment index or score, so M0, which has risen from wave 1 to wave 2 by about 2 percentage points. Our results are consistent with the Feed the Future report, which is a baseline cross-country report done in 2014 for Nepal, which shows that the disempowerment index was around in the same ballpark of 21%, and that the 5DE index was about really similar at 79%. So here, when we focus particularly on women, we observe that the disempowerment headcount has increased from wave 1 to wave 2 by about 14 percentage points, which is a figure that's far higher than for men. This is also true for the disempowerment index or score, which has risen from wave 1 to wave 2 by about 5 percentage points. Could you go to the next slide, please? Great. Now I'd like us to examine the uncensored headcount ratio for the 6 A-WEAI indicators decomposed by key heterogeneous groups, or in our case, gender intersectionalities, as we focus here on women only and only using the second wave of the data collection process. Our choice of population subgroups by which we decompose these figures by is guided by the larger empirical literature on and deprivation profiles of the Nepali female population. The evidence suggests that gender discrimination may also intersect with other forms of social exclusion and discrimination, whereby such groups often suffer additional barriers to overcoming inequality and vulnerability. So here we most compelling results from our analysis from the large number of groups that we had initially selected, and then these are the ones that are statistically significant. Important to note here, just from a methodological standpoint, that our analysis is performed on the same respondent per household that answers the survey both in 2017 and 2020. So this means that the replacement households and respondents that change between the waves were not included. So you can consider this somewhat of a restricted analysis. In the appendix of this presentation, we also offer the results of the unrestricted analysis. So we include everyone who was involved in the data collection. So we provide this as a kind of sensitivity check. And as you can see, the numbers remain largely the same. Here, the following table and graph show, if you can go back one, shows decomposition of uncensored headcount by household per capita income terciles. The key differences here among women by this indicator are shown to be in group membership, where women of the lowest income tercile are most likely to experience deprivation in group membership. And there are other differences among women by per capita terciles within the workload indicator, where those in the middle tercile are most deprived. Next slide, please. The next subgroup we were interested in analyzing is one on household migration status. So this is an important subgroup as Nepal has very high rates of particularly male out migration, both internally and internationally. So here we delineate between two key groups. Here, the international migrant household defined as a household where there's at least one adult migrant who is currently migrated or has done so in the last 12 months. Any international destination, including India, and then the non-international migrant households are ones that either do not have any current migrants, whether international or internal, or have or a migrant in the last 12 months. So here we can see from the table as well as the graphical representation that a higher proportion of women in international migrant households experience disempowerment in these three indicators, input in productive decisions, control over use of income, and workload. All these results are statistically significant at the 95% confidence interval. Next slide, please. So as explained in the country context earlier, women who are ethnic minorities, considered low caste, and also living in certain ecological zones often suffer from heightened material deprivation and social exclusion. Women in particular are most disadvantaged, as we can see from the graph and the table, only in ownership of assets. Next slide, please. And then finally, here we're looking at the different ecological zones, the Terai and the hills. And from what we observe, our data suggests that women living in remote and often inaccessible hills are most likely to be deprived in terms of group membership. There's also one particular indicator that we weren't able to present here in the presentation, and that is a statistic based on the contribution to disempowerment. So this describes how much each indicator has contributed to disempowerment among respondents who have not achieved empowerment. And this is calculated by the indicator weight multiplied by the censored headcount ratio of that indicator. So for the purposes of our report, we calculated this results for women only for wave 2. And I think subsequently it would be interesting to compare wave 1 and wave 2 to see if this has differed. We have found that group membership has contributed the most to disempowerment for women, 73.6%, and followed by workload at 15.2%. This result is also consistent with the Feed the World baseline report for Nepal, which also cites group membership as the key contributor to women's disempowerment. And I think that's it for my contribution. I think I'm right on time, which is great. Thank you very much for listening.
Great, thank you, Rumbi. Now let me invite Hazel, our second discussant, to share her feedback on this part of the presentation.
Yeah, great. Yes, thank you, Ara, and thank you, Rumbi, for that really interesting set of results. Because we don't have a lot of time, I'm gonna sort of try to focus on a couple, just a few key suggestions. First of all, I just wanted to kind of say that this is a really interesting way to present these sort of descriptive results around different kinds, sort of looking at the different characteristics, so income, ethnicity, migration status. So I think that's really interesting way to use A-WEAI. So just to kind of want to mention that. The one thing I wasn't super sure about based on the presentation is whether you actually did interview 2 respondents per household, because this is a phone-in survey. I wasn't quite sure whether you did that, and I see Erdgin is nodding. So did you do the two interviews, male and female, or not? And the reason I bring that up is because one of the key suggestions I kind of want to suggest you consider is, in addition to migration status, it might also be interesting to look at household structure. So for example, you know, who's the respondent? Is it a female head, and then is the male counterpart, is it a younger son, is it a non-migrant spouse? Or I think the intra-household dynamics there could be quite different. And so in past work on Nepal, for example, we've tended to do the analysis sort of separately by household structure. So that might be something that you may want to either cross with migration status or kind of look at it on its own. And you kind of read my mind, Rumbi, when you started talking about the censored headcount and the disempowerment bars. I think the uncensored scores were interesting, but I think what it hides is that it combines sort of these inadequacies across the full sample. So whether the woman is empowered or not, you see whether they're achieving or not the indicator. And so in the way, I think the reason for the focus on the censored indicator results and those disempowerment bars that you would come across usually is that it focuses on the disempowered, sort of the subset of women and men that are disempowered, and what are the contributors to that. So I think looking at that in comparison to these results would be super interesting as well. And then maybe just to end with a note of caution around comparing it to the Feed the Future results. So there are kind of 2 main complications here. So one is that one is that those are considering the full WEAI, right? So it's using really more indicators than what you're using here. So you're only using 6 of them. So it includes more indicators. But the other thing is that they're looking at a different sort of geographical area compared to yours. And I quickly looked at the map and I noticed that I think there are only 2 districts that the dark blue ones on the leftmost side of your map are the only ones that seem to overlap. That said, it would be possible to actually drill down on those districts. So if you truly wanted to make that comparison, I suggest looking at those same districts and then just maybe trying to look at it for maybe group membership or some kind of other very specific indicators that are of interest, but it's not a straightforward exercise. I don't know how worthwhile that exercise would be, but those are just a couple of suggestions. I have other smaller questions that I'll put in the chat, and maybe Rumbi and I can continue chatting as the webinar goes on. So thank you.
Thank you, Hazel. Okay, now we'll move on to the last part of the presentation by Annarita.
So hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. In this part, I'm trying to present you some results on the COVID impact on the A-WEAI indicator. But first, let me introduce the COVID-19 in Nepal. There is compelling evidence on the impact of COVID-19 and its containing measure on people's livelihoods and income. And in particular, in rural area, despite this topic is very important and relevant, is often overlooked. And the reason for this is first, usually a kind of lack of data, but also because we can think that actually lockdown measure affected less agricultural production and food activities. And also lockdown measures usually affect more urban areas, even though the rural areas face a number of challenges which are really relevant, such as loss of remittances from migrant households, return migrants in rural areas, as well as a drop in demand of some commodities, and not less important, disruption in the food system supply chain. For example, fertilizer that is completely important from abroad were not coming because of the restriction. Rural areas have also a higher rate of food insecurity and poverty well before the pandemic, as well as a lack of formal financial risk management tools and safety network. So all these factors makes people in rural areas more sensitive to loss of income and to the loss of livelihoods because of the COVID-19 and its related measure. So the first case of COVID in Nepal was recorded on the 23rd of January, and some months later, on the 24th of March, actually the government imposed a very strict measure, including lockdowns, closure of non-essential business, school closure, and restriction on travel, among others. And these measures, besides being really required to contain the spread of the virus, of course, affected income and livelihoods of people. So next slide, please. As Erdgin introduced, women in Nepal experience higher disequality. Nepal is often classified as a patriarchal and patrilineal country. So women experience gender-based gap in access to health, education. They have higher prevalence of poverty, of malnutrition. They face mobility constraint and have a lot of care responsibility within a household, which prevent them to seek better job opportunity, full-time job opportunity, and experience also restrictive legislation with respect to gender. So in this context, the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to exacerbate this gender-based gap. In fact, we expect that the unpaid care workload of women is likely to increase because of the school closure, because eventually if there is an ill person in the household, is women that need to take care of them. And also women lose control of emergency savings because of this economic toll that the COVID-19 imposed on rural households. In a context where decision-making and ownership of assets were already limited for them. The pandemic is also likely to make worse the food insecurity of some vulnerable subgroups, including women. And according to this CARE Nepal report, 83% of women lost their job, posing them at the risk of higher income losses. So basically, the aim of our research is trying to explore the consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic and its related measure on both the gender equality and women's empowerment. Next slide, please. So our data collection, as Erdgin presented, has a large data collection on COVID disruption. And in particular, we were able to observe self-reported COVID-induced food insecurity experience, change in remittances due to COVID, change in hours worked due to COVID, and also COVID-induced income shocks. Next slide, please. So this graph shows you the percentage of households who attribute their food insecurity experience to the COVID-19. The result shows that overall, the 21% of households in the panel attribute their food experience to COVID-19. And in particular, there is statistically significant differences between lower income and upper income, with upper income being less represented in households who attribute their food insecurity experience to COVID-19. But then when we look at change in remittances due to COVID, we can see that the 37% of international migrant households receiving remittances report a loss of remittances due to COVID-19. Regarding the change in hours worked due to COVID-19, we can see that women report, an higher share of women report no change, and this difference is statistically significant when compared to the proportion of men reporting no change, as well as a lower proportion of women report a decrease in hours worked due to COVID, again, statistically significant when compared to male. Next slide, please. But given that this is my main variable of interest that I'm going to explore it in the next analysis, let me focus on the loss of income due to COVID-19. Well, we measure, for every individual, we measure the employment activity in which he or she was involved. Because of course, in these kind of areas, usually people are involved in multiple activity to sustain their livelihoods. For example, in our sample, more or less the 55% of individuals were engaged in more than one livelihood activities. So by every employment activity, we ask whether they have experienced a loss of income due to COVID in the last 6 months. So since March. And then we aggregate to report if individuals experienced a loss of income in at least one employment activity. And results show that overall, the 57% of our individuals report a loss of income due to COVID. And when we explore the heterogeneous differences among subgroups, we can see that, for example, a higher proportion of individuals in high-income households experience loss of income due to COVID, and these results are consistent with a bunch of studies, among others, Mahmoud and Riley in 2020, who in Uganda report that actually wealthier households report more income loss due to COVID. When we look at women compared to men, we can see that actually more men are likely to report a loss of income due to COVID, but these need to be understood in the context of pre-existing differences between men and women already before the pandemic. In fact, women are usually more engaged in non-paid activities, both on-farm and off-farm, and have also less access to off-farm labor market opportunities. So this result might be explained with respect to understanding the pre-existing differences. Next slide, please.
Annarita, really sorry to interrupt. Could you please wrap in like 2-3 minutes so that we can have a time to just take 1 or 2 questions at the end? Thanks.
Sure. So in a nutshell, what I'm going to show you is the results of our research question that try to provide some causal evidence on how the COVID-19 affected gender equality and women's empowerment. In doing so, we rely on the instrumental variable approach, and our main outcomes are the empowerment, the domains of empowerment in agriculture. Next slide, please. So actually disentangling the causal effect from other socioeconomic factors that might be driving both COVID-induced shocks and empowerment is quite challenging, and the challenge is due to endogeneity concern that in this context could happen both because of the omitted variable bias and both because of reverse causality. So we might think that actually more empowered individuals are more likely to be treated or rather to experience a COVID-induced shocks. In order to address this endogeneity, we thought about different strategy, and in the sake of time, I'm going to talk about only the IV instrumental variable approach, even though in the appendix you can find further details about our attempt in trying to implement a difference in difference estimation strategy on matched data. So if our model is described by A-WEAI equal to beta 0 plus beta 1 xi1 plus beta 2 xi2 plus epsilon 1 I, where yi is our outcome of interest, that is the deprivation indicator in our 6 core A-WEAI indicator, and if our I1 is our treatment and is endogenous, where our treatment is defined as equal to 1 is the individual experience a COVID-induced income shock, 0 otherwise. Then if we estimate without addressing the endogeneity beta 1, we get biased results. We can remove the bias relying on an instrument that, conditional on being valid and relevant, provide a unbiased estimate of beta 1. And as an instrument, we choose to use the average shocks at the ward level. This choice needs to be understood in the sense that we are trying to exploit some source of exogenous variation in the disruption of COVID-induced shocks. Next slide, please. Again, in the sake of time, I'm going straight away to the preliminary results. And actually, experience a COVID-induced income shock is likely to increase the probability of being disempowered with respect to ownership of asset, access to and decision on credit, and workload. Next slide, please. In order to investigate some socioeconomic gradients, we focused on women only, but again, the results were in line with the previous one. Let me mention that these results are robust to different specification, and all the one that you see controls for observables such as age square, education, ecological zone, district fixed effect, household size, income, ethnicity, and migration in the household. Next slide. So future research idea, role of empowerment in increasing resilience to food insecurity due to COVID-19. We would like also to investigate the relationship between social protection and empowerment, as well as the empowerment and climate change relationship. In our research agenda, there is also the relationship between empowerment and agricultural productivity, and trying to assess the item invariance through time and using the item response theory methods. Thank you.
Thanks, Annarita. I'll hand it over to Jessica for her comments.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss this presentation. I'll just share some brief thoughts. This is a really interesting and rich analysis with a lot of different directions to explore. So one of my first suggestions is to perhaps kind of partition more the discussion of remittances vis-a-vis the main analysis of COVID impacts. So it's clear that remittances is a challenge, loss of remittances. I didn't quite follow what the magnitude of this effect was. So how many households actually have lost remittances in the sample? But when we see the effects on income by source, this is actually a very consistent pattern, right? So it's not restricted to households that have international migrants. In fact, the effect is larger for households that don't have international migrants. So it's not primarily a story about lost remittances. And the highest probability of losing income is actually for salaried laborers, I presume domestically. So I think in that sense, the remittances analysis doesn't directly feed in to the analysis of income loss due to COVID, because that's a much broader story. This leads me to my second point. So depending on the cause of the income shock, there could be many reasons that particular cause leads to shift in empowerment. So if, for example, there is a migrant, either domestic or international, who returns to the household, that's a huge change in intra-household patterns, decision-making beyond the income effect. If there's an employed individual who now is sent home or is frequently home, that would also lead to a big shift. And if the reason that employment has decreased is local lockdowns, that could also affect other types of services the household access. So children may be home. I'm not sure if there were school closures in Nepal, but those were almost universal. There may be loss in access to other types of services. So I think it's really important to unpack the source of the income shock, because that source may also be creating other types of shifts in the household environment that could affect empowerment very substantially. And I don't want to take too much time to talk about the IV, but it's worth again noting that the local value of the shock may also be capturing some of these other factors. It may be capturing local variation in non-agricultural employment, local variation in lockdowns, how stringent lockdowns were. And so that may be another channel for directly affecting the WEAI. I can see a case then for exploring a simple specification without the IV, but just attempting to capture more of these other channels, potentially through additional control variables. Thank you very much. It was really interesting to see the preliminary results.
All right, thanks Jessica for your comments, and many thanks to our three presenters for sharing this really interesting work with the A-WEAI and COVID. And you know, as everybody I'm sure has noticed, we've had a pretty vibrant chat going on the side. So before we launch into our Q&A, hopefully people can stay an additional 5-10 minutes to kind of wrap up today. I guess I just wanted to ask and check with the presenters if there are any points or comments that they've already made in the chat that they'd like to address more directly.
No, I would like to thank the discussants for their great comments. I mean, I was so attracted by their comments that I completely lost track of the I don't see the chat, which by the way has very, very, very interesting comments indeed. So I hope you can save and send us back the chat later. So a point that Jessica made, basically, yes, we would like to look also at in another paper, not the effect of remittances, to understand better the pathways of that type of impact. Of course, it can be done very easily, but I mean, of course, also the IV would need to change. Maybe you can use some of the IVs that we used also for other papers with Vani in the past, like looking at migration networks, and also using climate indicators as an instrument for that. In terms of people, we had, the only thing is that we have about 100 households reporting a loss on remittances. So that is a bit, I mean, it's about 10% of the sample, which can allow us to do some analysis, but it's a bit on the low side in terms of sample size. That's all from my side.
Thanks. I think oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Hi, Emily. Yeah, can I just share a short point? And that basically relates to the fact that subsequent to this study, you know, the government of Nepal, especially our Reserve Bank also came up with data, at a micro level that kind of, was very anti-intuitive, in the sense that we had assumed that because of the lockdown, remittance coming from abroad had actually decreased, but the Central Reserve Bank's data showed that the remittance has actually increased. And there may be various reasons for that. We suspect that the migrant laborers may have thought that their families were in hardship, so had tried to, push more resources, through banking sources. Earlier, people may have sent a lot of resources through informal means, but then after lockdown, they were sending resources through, formal means. So this was very anti-intuitive, but then the government data clearly showed that, remittance had in fact increased. But I'm not sure to what extent this has really been captured to our survey, because the data that I'm sharing is the data from the central, the Reserve Bank of Nepal. Thanks, Emily.
All right, thank you very much. And I can see in the chat, the one question that I was going to raise that I didn't think had been answered was the one about using the speaker phones. I'm also just catching up in the chat here. Process less than 10%. Okay. So
Can I answer that quickly? Yeah.
Please do.
Yeah. So we wanted to make sure that our respondents do not put the phone into a format where, all the people nearby can listen. So even prior to the interview, we asked that they themselves only speak on the phone and do not put it in the mode that others can listen to. And I would also want to add that, when this was one of the first, studies where we were doing, the phone service to CATI, and a lot of, strict protocols were not in place. So one of the instructions that we had given to our team was to try as many times as possible, to get through to the respondents. I just also wanted to add that, and IDA Nepal School has also been involved in other studies with partnerships that involve IFPRI, where, more stricter protocols have been in place. So I think that is a topic for another discussion. But at the time that we did the work with FAO, there weren't any strict protocols in place. I just wanted to add that note as well. Thanks.
Thank you for that explanation. So it seems like the chat has gotten a bit quieter. Let's see. I'm curious. It seems, Rumbi, you've had a lot of comments here at the end. I was curious if you wanted to answer anything directly. Not to put you on the spot, but.
I think the comment made by Elizabeth Bryan was very interesting. I think she posed a really interesting research question, asking whether it was interesting to explore whether women's empowerment can protect against negative outcomes of shocks or stressors, whether it serves as an important resilience capacity. So he's asking if it's possible to assess if these coping strategies can vary by empowerment levels. And it's very interesting because that's one of the research topics that we thought would be interesting to look at, is seeing women's empowerment as a key mediator. How does that able to reduce or blunt the shock of these crisis periods, particularly when it comes to food insecurity? And we're very lucky to be able to collect the information using the FIES survey. So being able to use the FIES data, which already has a standard methodology that is recognized worldwide, I think it'd be very interesting to be able to run some causal regressions. Hopefully we can find some pretty good IVs to be able to assess if there is indeed a causal link between the two, using the data in the second wave.
All right, thank you. So does anybody else in the audience have any questions for the team? Okay, if not, I guess, oh, I see a hand is up from Valentina. Yes.
Yes, hi everyone. Sorry, I mean, if we need to leave, we can leave. So no, yeah, thanks so much for this very interesting session. I already put so many questions, and I know that I will keep talking with Erdgin, Rumbi, and Annarita for sure. But so just very quick questions. It's more about like curiosity. If you're gonna also explore as a result, also like by men and women, and try to compare any significant difference between the two in terms of COVID income shocks, because I didn't really get why you only present the women results. Thanks so much.
I can respond quickly because the way how the sample is designed. So basically on migrant households, we used to interview only women. So because most of the migration is male out migration, so 90% of the sample was basically women. So we have only women for migrant households, while we have 50-50 for the non-migrant households, basically. So this is why, being two different groups, we decided not to focus on women only, also because the sample size for men is much smaller. In any case, we'll have the estimates for both groups, and we'll look at those. The issue is that the statistical power for men only. So what we'll do is to look at women only and men and women together. But keeping in mind also, we will be using the weights also to make sure, because these are two different groups somehow, no?
All right, thank you. So we're about 8 minutes over time. Is there like one last question from anybody? Okay, I don't see any action in the chat. If that's the case, I'd just like to once again thank everybody for attending, for presenting, for discussants. Looking forward to seeing more of the analysis and learning, more from this really interesting work. So thanks everybody, very appreciative on behalf of the We Validate seminars, the Gender Methods module, and the Gender Task Force. Thanks for joining us today, and have a good one.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you again, Rumbi and Annarita.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.